Welcome to the Muscle Expert Podcast with Ben Pakulski, one of the world's top professional bodybuilders, an expert on human performance and mindset mastery. Ben dives deep to deliver the strategies of the top experts to upgrade your body, mind, muscle, strength, performance, biochemistry, and how to become the upgraded modern man. Join us on benpakulski.com to learn the cutting-edge techniques to take control of your body, your brain, and create your greatest life.
Hey, what's up, everybody? Ben Pakulski is back in the house with another episode of the Muscle Expert Podcast. I have an amazing guest for you here, Mr. Roland Pankewich, who is an optimal health practitioner. Today we're going to talk about digestion, the benefits of digestion for optimizing health. We're going to talk a little bit about circadian rhythms, metabolic function, and how to optimize fat burning. Roland, how you doing, man?
I'm doing really well. How are you, my friend?
I'm excellent. Thank you. Welcome, and thank you very much for joining me.
Oh, thanks for having me. It's an honor to be on.
So Roland and I have a very brief history of knowing each other, but I was extremely impressed with his credentials, and he's an extremely bright guy after having had a few conversations with him. So I thought, what better opportunity than to bring him on the podcast and have him teach you guys some of his golden nuggets about health, function, and just living a better life. So Roland, what do you want to start the conversation about today, man? I know we talked about, let's roll with the idea of, most bodybuilders are so set in the mindset of, I just need to eat calories to grow. It's really ironic that I actually wrote an article about this yesterday, how, arbitrary calories is a thing of the 1980s and 90s, and now being mindful of what you eat, when you eat it, and optimizing your digestion is such a massive part of optimizing muscle building and health in general. So I'd love for you to start giving some insights and feedback as to where people should start. So I'm going to assume that everybody listening to this podcast is probably pretty damn close to not optimizing anything with respect to digestion. So if we could give them some golden nugget takeaways as to, where to go and how to start, I think that would be a great way to kick off the conversation.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. And, you set me up with some expectations here. I better deliver, right?
Yeah, man.
So the digestion conversation is interesting because it's of the utmost importance, but it's not sexy. It's the exact opposite of sexy. We're turning food into waste, right? But what's important about digestion is the fundamental process of what allows your body to turn the food we eat into the cells that you become. And in the case of someone who's looking to build muscle, obviously the bias is towards muscle mass and accumulation of muscle mass. So the digestive process in and of itself is kind of contingent on controlling a whole bunch of other body processes. Digestion connects to the immune system. It connects to the neurological system. It connects to inflammatory responses. And many people go through life with suboptimal digestion, thinking that those things should just be normal. I mean, all you have to do is watch TV for a while and see how many of those Pepto-Bismol commercials or those Zantac commercials are basically promoting you can eat the foods you love without any of the consequence. But no one is thinking, what do these consequences mean? And there's symptoms, right? So if someone has heartburn, they have bloating, they have indigestion, they have poor bowel habits, they go to the washroom too little or they go too frequently, that's a sign that the system is out of balance, and they have to go back to basics to understand how digestion is meant to work in the first place. I don't know if it's okay with you, Ben, but maybe we can do like a digestion crash course on how everything's supposed to work.
Yeah, man, I think that's a great idea. Just speaking to the fact that you're saying nutrition isn't, or digestion isn't sexy, I think the ideal scenario, most people are after the impossible dream of being able to eat whatever they want and look, as good as they possibly can, or look like some of the professional athletes out there. And people need to realize that, one, those professional athletes are extremely genetically blessed to be able to eat whatever they want, but they're also not optimized. And if they ate better nutritionally, they would actually have better results and less negative side effects. And that's one of the things that people neglect to realize is they look at these guys who are Insta-famous, eating pancakes and donuts every day, and they go, oh man, I just want to be able to eat that and look the way they do. But there's a lot of things behind the scenes going on that you guys don't see. Is chemically, as far as how their digestion is. It's not normal to live your life with gas. It's not normal to live your life with poor digestion, bloating, Although it's kind of like back pain, right? People wake up every day with back pain. They just kind of assume, well, shit, I've got some back pain, and it's okay. But it's not. Like, you can get that back pain fixed just like you can fix your digestion. So, Roland, let's walk through what you would suggest as a crash course in digestion.
Absolutely, yeah, and that's a good point. And even those insta-famous people who can seem to eat anything, there will be a day where it catches up with them because everyone is biochemically unique. And that means that the amount of stress someone's system can tolerate varies among individuals. And those people might just have those genetic blessings in that regard, but it doesn't mean that it's optimal nor that it's something that's sustainable. So when looking at digestion, the first thing we need to understand is going to sound so obvious, but we need to really focus on chewing our food, right? Digestion starts before you even take your first bite. It's when you smell food. I mean, think about when you're in your families for the holidays. You walk in the house, what's the first thing you notice? You notice the smell of whatever's in the kitchen, right? That actually sets the tone for your digestion. It allows for saliva to be produced. It allows the pancreas to start remedying enzymes. Hydrochloric acid in the stomach gets primed. So that first aspect of digestion comes from smelling food, and then when we can actually chew and taste our food. I used to work as a personal trainer, and I used to be able to pride myself in pounding a full chicken breast with rice or sweet potatoes and greens in about 5 minutes in between clients. And little did I know that I was doing a whole host of damage because your stomach doesn't have teeth. So unless you actually what's called masticate, break the food down fully, you don't give your stomach the exposed surface area so things like hydrochloric acid and enzymes can actually work on them. And why it's even more important for bodybuilders is if you don't chew properly, all protein digestion is contingent upon what happens in the stomach. And if you don't have enough stomach acid, you don't break the food down enough, there's a good chance you won't break your proteins down properly.
So one thing I started doing, and you can tell me, be transparent if this is good or bad, but a long time ago I started using ground meats just for that exact reason, right? Because obviously, the sheer volume of meat I need to eat on a day-to-day basis is high. So obviously I'm using enzymes to assist in the process, but I recommend to a lot of my clients to use ground meat because it's not like it's obviously pre-digested, but certainly broken down a lot more than a piece of steak may be. What are your thoughts about that?
Absolutely a smart idea because anything that you can do to take the load off of the system, if you are in the process of trying to increase muscle mass, what you're basically doing is you're going to force your system to work harder than the average. So if you can have those little life hacks that can reduce the stress on the system, that's a great idea. So yeah, I think you're bang on there, Ben.
Okay, cool. Sorry to interrupt you.
No worries. No, it's a good thing to jump in with. So the other reason I want to highlight the initial stages of digestion is we have this thing that's called the acid trigger. So when we actually break food down in our stomach, the pH, which is the measure of acidity, gets super low if we have healthy digestion, somewhere between like 1.5 and 2. And that allows the proteins to be broken down. So imagine like the analogy is like a beaded necklace, right? Proteins are just amino acids strung together. So what the acid and the enzymes do is they start cutting the beads into what are called peptides, which are little amino acid chains. And if you don't break food down enough, that doesn't happen to the point where your body will have an easy time furthering that process when food leaves the stomach, gets into the small intestine, and it interacts with enzymes that get released from the pancreas, as well as things like bile and bicarbonate that gets also released from the pancreas.
Yeah, I think that's definitely something that's a massive concern. Is I know so many bodybuilders just say, well, you need to eat more protein. It's never about, the obvious response or rebuttal is it's never about what you eat, it's what you absorb. So that's definitely a huge point. As far as any negative effects, other than obviously not absorbing or digesting, any negative effects to having large peptides of protein floating around or large undigested protein in your bowels?
That's a great question, and there's a couple things. So let's look at the best case scenario. Undigested protein ferments, and the example I always use is, have you ever left a little bit of protein in a shaker cup and found it like a month later?
Of course.
What does that smell like?
Awesome.
It makes your nostrils burn, right? So protein has this ability to putrefy. So if you're someone who can clear a room when you drop a fart, that's a sign that things probably aren't the best in your inner system, and you want to take a step back and maybe look at some aspects of improving digestive support or the entire process of how you approach eating. Because eating in a relaxed state is going to be very different than eating in a stressed state. The second part to that question is, if you have poor digestive function, if you have this thing called leaky gut, which is basically when undigested peptides can get through the digestive system into the bloodstream, you can sensitize yourself and your immune system to foods, and you can develop what's called a food allergy. And any time you eat that food, the immune system will remember it. And over the course of weeks, months, years, if you can chronically expose yourself to that, you can have a pretty substantial inflammatory response that causes a whole bunch of immune system dysregulation. And here's an interesting thing. Everyone blames gluten nowadays for what happens to us. It's gluten's fault. It's inflammatory. It's problematic. Gluten's a protein that we don't digest very well. But in order for gluten to be a problem, your immune system has to be a problem, first of all. So you have to have exposed yourself to something food-related over time that your body can no longer process or tolerate. That can happen with eggs. It can happen with any protein. So, it's a long way of saying if you don't break your proteins down properly, there can be some peripheral downstream effects that aren't going to serve you, especially when it comes to muscle building, because inflammation is an underlying mechanism of every aspect of the degeneration and disease process.
Based on what you're saying, reading into things, it sounds like the idea of fasting may actually be a solution for people who have undigested proteins or eating too much protein and didn't do a very good job, masticating. Any thoughts then on fasting's application for bodybuilding? And would it be too negative and too detrimental for a bodybuilder who's really trying to optimize every pound of muscle? Would it be too negative, have too many negative effects to consider fasting? And is that even a good thought?
It's an interesting question you propose, just because human beings likely did evolve, and we're talking not bodybuilding, we're talking evolution and survival here with periods of fasting. That's why we can store a lot of fat and we can release fat for energy as our principal source of what sustains us. Yep. The benefit of fasting is when you take energy resources or the requirements of energy resources away from the digestive system, they can be directed to other things. So a lot of the time it can be healing, because the body doesn't know how to destroy itself. It only knows how to self-heal, providing you provide the right signals. So if a bodybuilder is fasting, what is the downside? Let's look at the negatives first. Well, you're not getting food coming in, so you have two options. You can break down stored body fat if you have good metabolic function. You can break down stored glycogen, which has a finite supply. And you can break down some amino acids, meaning your body will likely start to become more catabolic because it does need to derive energy to repair these processes. But the benefit of having a period of fasting in your life is it does allow your body some time to regenerate without being stressed if there is a problem with your digestion. The way I think that you can balance the two worlds, not sacrificing too much in terms of calorie intake, but getting some of the benefits of fasting, what I do with a lot of my clients and athletes is I have them implement a 12-hour fast, meaning if they have their last meal at 7 p.m. in the evening, their breakfast would be at 7 a.m. with nothing but maybe water and non-calorie containing liquids in between. So they still have the benefits of that nightly cycle where there is a digestive kind of cleaning out and repair process. There is some detoxification that goes on, but those are energy resources that don't happen unless you do have a bit of a restricted time feeding window.
Is that something you recommend on a day-to-day basis or like a couple times a week, or what's your thought?
I do that on a day-to-day basis. I recommend for the average person, it's something that you can do because as we get into the evening, things like insulin sensitivity, anabolic aspects of building muscle, they actually, from what I've read, become less important. Not less important, but insulin sensitivity goes down in the evening, for example. So if you continue eating, there's a higher likelihood that your body, based upon the fact that it's darkness, and darkness is a signal, is not going to be putting those calories to use for building muscle or regenerating energy. So what ends up happening is the likelihood of storing extra calories as fat becomes a bigger problem. So that's something you can do, or you can do something where you do a bit of a cyclic once a week, 12, 14, 16-hour fast. And what people will probably be surprised at is if you do that once a week, you're really not going to lose a lot of muscle tissue, because if you're allowing your body to do a little bit of a cyclical clean out and you're cleaning out old wasted cells, it's a process called autophagy, you're actually regenerating the ability to improve the robustness of metabolic function and lowering inflammation. And anytime you can lower inflammation, that's, in my opinion, a likely obstacle to building muscle.
I completely agree, man. I actually advocate, a lot of bodybuilders go, should I wake up in the middle of the night and have a protein shake or have food? Obviously, the answer to that is absolutely, unequivocally no. I advocate low protein consumptions and sometimes even no protein, or at least no meat one day a week for a lot of my clients. Some guys, bodybuilders obviously have been condemned over the years for distension. And obviously some of that can be chemically influenced, but some of it I think is just the sheer amount of food that's undigested. When you're 250 pounds plus of muscle, there's just a lot of food that needs to be eaten. So for those guys, I often recommend not eating any hard protein, any solid protein those days. You can have a shake, or you can have some egg whites or eggs or something that's a little bit easier in the digestive tract. But I've seen that to get really, really good results. And guys have to say they feel better, to your point of digestion and inflammation, right? I feel
Absolutely.
like their joints are going to hurt less. Systemic inflammation is going to be much lower. I don't know the mechanism. Maybe we can talk a little bit about that. Is there a reason for that?
Yeah, there's a couple things going on. So it kind of plays off of what I was mentioning before, but to further it, when you don't put food in the system can calm down, right? So the digestive system itself is an organ, but there's an organ within the organ. So there's something that's called the microbiome. So we have about 4.5 pounds of bacteria that live inside of us. And the population, the diversity of these bacteria are reflective of the foods we eat. So, for example, if we have a scenario where someone's eating a really high-protein diet, they're not getting a lot of good fermentable fibers, they're not getting a lot of plant foods, that might thin the herd in terms of how many diverse bacteria that are actually beneficial can live inside you. And if you imagine or envision a teeter-totter in your mind, you want the at least neutral or beneficial bacteria always to greatly outweigh the negative pathogenic bacteria. If you continually put in non-fermentable foods, i.e. a ton of protein, there are certain bacteria that can actually start to build up, and those guys can cause a cascade of effects. One can be localized fermentation of when you put carbohydrates in there, so it can actually negatively interact with certain starches. The other thing is it can promote local and systemic inflammation, because if you have leaky gut, those inflammatory compounds can get into general circulation, and that can cause some problems downstream. So if you're constantly stressing the system, it's like, you hired someone to work 40 hours a week, but you're basically putting them on chronic overtime without compensating them anymore. You're going to get really grumpy after a while. So when you take a break from that, the whole system has the ability to calm down. And something I use strategically is if someone is terrified about losing muscle mass, you do need amino acids to detoxify. So the more you stress your digestive system, the more you stress the liver. If you don't have those essential amino acids, things like cysteine, methionine, taurine, glycine, you do potentially have a lowered ability to detoxify some of these inflammatory compounds. So you can use an essential amino acid complex,
right,
but refrain from eating anything that requires the whole cascade of digestion to happen. And if you do this strategically, you stimulate a process called autophagy, which is almost like, the cleaning crew comes in, it looks for old worn out cells, and it can initiate like a self-destruct signal, and the body recycles those materials and can use them to make new cellular structural tissue. So it's a recycling process that only happens when the body isn't chronically breaking down food and getting food. It's the fasting pathway activates certain signals that are opposite of when you're chronically eating. Autophagy and things like IGF-1 and mTOR, those are pathways that are kind of diametric opposites.
Yeah.
You want the building ones when you're trying to build muscle, but if you don't allow for the cleanup to happen, your place is always going to get dirty, right?
I love that you brought that up. So that's one thing that we've kind of really been diving into a little bit here at the gym. The idea that mTOR, you almost lose sensitization. You lose the ability to stimulate mTOR. So this idea of stimulating autophagy sounds like it could be a more necessary component than we think.
It's all about balance.
Yeah.
It's really all because the body has, when we look at anabolic and catabolic nature, there's an anabolic and catabolic cycle based upon someone's, age, their activity. It all matters. Mm-hmm. But when you chronically stimulate the anabolic side of things, you do need the ability to balance the requisite catabolic side of things, because when you're always building up, your body is never able to, use the immune system to sniff out things like cancerous cells or potentially old worn out cells, things that need to be recycled. And that's why I like the 12-hour fast for the average person. And even if you are a bodybuilder, even in that 12-hour window, there's a lot of calories you theoretically could consume in that 12-hour window, which would necessitate the equivalent amount of time to allow the system to calm down and relax, So you can continue to eat that amount of calories, absorb that nutrition optimally, derive the benefit from it, but also not stress the system and chronically activate the mTOR and IGF pathways.
Yeah, and another thing to realize, I think, for the guys listening is you can't grow in a linear fashion. You can't constantly be stimulating mTOR and IGF pathways in hopes of being as big as Ronnie Coleman in the shortest amount of time possible. It just doesn't work that way. There has to be a period of, like you say, of balance. I think that's a very important realization for bodybuilders to make, is growth can never be linear. So your training shouldn't be linear, your nutrition shouldn't be linear, everything needs to fluctuate, and obviously you want to constantly be making progress, but don't expect it to be constantly in one direction. Don't be afraid to take one step back. So one thing, Roland, that you keep bringing up is the idea of all these things leading to inflammation. And I'd like to dive into that a little bit more, because that's something that I bring up a lot. And I want guys to pay attention to inflammation, manage inflammation, because it's going to influence negatively muscle building. Can we talk about that a little bit?
Absolutely. And inflammation is one of my favorite topics. It's something I'm really diving into right now, and I think in some ways it's the most complex topic. So let's introduce inflammation in a couple different contexts. The classic inflammation people know is, when you roll an ankle, right? What happens? The ankle swells up, you elevate it, you ice it, you wait for it to get better, swelling goes down. That's like an immune system mediated inflammation thing. The same thing if you step on a rusty nail, your immune system is going to freak out, and inflammation is the first sign of healing. So that's something that can be influenced also by food choices. We can have things like immune complexes build up from foods we're allergic to. Those immune complexes can get into the system and affect things like joints, kidney function, liver function. But there's also another aspect of inflammation that can be tied to molecular level of activity. What I mean by that is, inside of the cell, we have these structures called mitochondria. Have you guys talked about mitochondria a lot on the podcast before?
Yeah, we have.
So mitochondria everyone says it's the powerhouse of the cell. It's a soundbite everyone knows, and it's true. Those are the only things in our body that can make any kind of concentrated energy in the presence of oxygen and food, but they're also things that can stimulate poor inflammatory responses because of things like free radical stress. So what basically happens is when we have these initial cascades of poor digestive function, poor immune function, these compounds, if you will, can actually get into different cellular structures, and they can stimulate the cell to turn on the genetics for making inflammation more easily to upregulate. It's actually called a pathway, NF-kappa B is the most famous one that I'm reading right now. Okay. And what ends up happening is if we don't have good metabolic function, we start to make too many free radicals. And these free radicals can be signaling molecules. And the mitochondria can talk to the nucleus of the cell. And if there's nutritional deficiencies, if there are any aspects of constant inflammatory cascade from undigested foods, inflammatory foods, lifestyle variables, poor sleep, poor endocrine function, the body says, well, we know that this is our new reality, so it actually changes the genetic expression of the cell to make it better at raising inflammation. And therefore, more inflammatory compounds are being secreted, and that's causing a change in the structure and the function of the cell. So what you want to do is figure out all the pathways in your life currently that you might be initiating more of an inflammatory response that's a sustained molecular inflammation, and try to turn those off. And a lot of the common things from a diet perspective are pro-inflammatory foods, like gluten can be one of them. If you're allergic to any protein, a lot of these processed foods, and people are crushing, starchy powders and things that have maybe pesticide chemical residues from poor quality food origin, things like glyphosate sprayed on corn. It could be something environmental if you live in a house where there's a lot of mold, a lot of environmental toxins. Anything that's going to stimulate the inflammatory pathway is going to compromise your ability to build muscle because it compromises mitochondrial function. The more inflammation you have, the more you start to cause premature mitochondrial death, which is the whole thing that props the cell's function up. So if you want to build muscle and optimize things like fat loss and performance, without a healthy metabolism, it doesn't happen. And healthy metabolism is not possible with having high levels of inflammation.
Man, that's amazing and extremely valuable, and I think that's going to be a lot of information for people to process. Can we
that's a lot of stuff.
That's good, man. Can we go back and just give them a few action items, like, hey, remove this from your diet, avoid this, or maybe even just discussing the specific pathways and which things they should remove to influence those pathways?
Yeah, so I mean, there's essentially two master switches, right? So one is the NF-kappa B pathway, the other one is the NRF2 pathway. The one that's problematic when it's constantly expressed is the NF-kappa B. So this comes from eating a lot of processed foods. I mean, you can eat too much, and excessive caloric intake that's undigested can stimulate that. Chronic stress, like these are the basic things, the basic building blocks of health come from regulating circadian rhythm, not having excessive amounts of artificial light at night, which can raise cortisol, not stimulating too much, even too much in the gym, right? Too much exercise can stimulate an unchecked inflammatory pathway response. So getting back to eating high quality food first, then quantity. You want to make sure that you're getting a large sum of plant-based foods that have different color. So the pigment in food alludes to potential nutrients in those foods. So, the blues and blueberries, the greens of kale, the reds in a pepper, the orange of an orange. All those compounds are phytonutrient antioxidants, for lack of a better description, that allow our body to help regulate inflammatory responses. So one thing that I always tell people is if you look at your diet, if you don't have at least 6 to 8 servings of plant foods a day, plus all of your protein, you're likely eating in an imbalanced pathway. That's one thing. The second thing would be, from a sleep perspective, knowing how to regulate your circadian rhythm, because all these things can be thrown off by something as simple as the wrong kind of light at the wrong time of day. So an example would be if you wake up in the morning, what's the first thing you do? Most people check their phone. That's artificial blue light, or they pop the TV on or go on their computer. Human beings should probably see light first thing in the day, and the sun is really what governs that whole thing. So the more we can live in the natural light cycle of when the sun goes up and the sun comes down, that helps to optimize those pathways too, because our body in the morning has high cortisol, but in the evening it has high melatonin. If you have a lot of oxidative stress from inflammation, melatonin, besides helping you sleep, is also a very powerful antioxidant, especially for the brain. It's probably second next to glutathione. So if you have a deficiency of antioxidants because of your lifestyle, that's also going to drive that inflammatory pathway up even higher. And there are certain foods you can use. Like one of the most powerful activators of the anti-inflammatory pathway are things like broccoli sprouts or putting turmeric or curcumin in your food. Omega-3s can help manage inflammatory pathway, as can good omega-6s from what's called GLA. So everyone, craps on omega-6. The wrong kinds of omega-6 are bad. Things like corn oil, sunflower, safflower oil. Always read the ingredients, never the nutritional panel of a food. But eating really high-quality omega-6 foods from borage and hemp and whatever else in the seed world that might provide that to you, those are actually anti-inflammatory if you look at the pathways of the essential fatty acids. So making sure that's a big thing. Not over-abusing carbohydrates. I mean, if you have blood sugar issues, that can exacerbate things. That can cause cortisol to be upregulated, which changes those pathways. And then knowing how to not stress out. I know it's a cliche thing to say, but the average person is living in fight or flight. If you're working in an office, you have Wi-Fi around you, you're on a computer all day long, you're sitting all day long, you're not moving. Getting into some meditation and some mindfulness can actually stimulate the brain to be able to calm the nervous system so it's not driving that pathway as much.
I'm so glad you brought all these things up because, bodybuilders have a reputation for being assholes. And I
think they're nice people. I don't know what you're talking about.
Well, no. Honestly, and I'm not trying to be, I'm not trying to judge or stereotype, but it's true. And they don't realize how much that has to do with the level of inflammation being caused in their gut by their poor digestion, all that stuff. As soon as you take those things away, you don't feel as negative toward the world. Things don't look as gloomy. You tend to smile a little bit more. So I get a lot of bodybuilders who come to me and they're assholes, and we'll manipulate their nutrition a little bit, take some inflammatory foods away. And all of a sudden they're like, man, you know what? I'm getting along with my wife a lot better. My sex life is a lot better. My training is better. I don't hurt as much. And they're like, man, imagine the correlation. Imagine the fact that these things actually are correlated. People don't put those things together, myself included, right? I'm dieting for a contest. Obviously, we're training too much. Our nutrition's imbalanced sometimes. And then you kind of get back to a normal life where you don't mind missing a couple meals, do a little bit of fasting, reduce your inflammation, pay a lot of attention to how your body feels. all of a sudden you're just a different person. It's such a fascinating thing, and people just don't make that correlation, between food and psychology and mental state. And I think that's something you and I need to get into on a future podcast.
I'd love to. I mean, you hit the nail on the head right there. Anything that comes into your body, food, supplements, even these modalities that you may use, be it like something like hyperbaric oxygen or cold exposure, it's all just a signal for the body. And the body is going to respond to what signals it predominantly experiences. And the cool thing about the body, but also the challenging thing, is the more often it gets the same signal, the more it knows to respond to that almost in an automated fashion. So, if you have, like you said, poor digestive health, and you start getting an inflammatory response and it changes your behavior, I mean, everything's interconnected. A leaky gut, you can assume you have a leaky brain. And if you start messing with the brain, that's a very fragile organ because it's not meant to be experiencing all these inflammatory compounds. And if that activates your chronic fight or flight response, guess what you lose most often? It's the pathway that you never stimulate. So if you start to change your behavior, that's going to be exacerbated by the fact that if everything you do in your lifestyle continues to stimulate that, you're going to have a harder time to get it back, and you have to do more to undo what you've done in order to restore balance, which is why I like that you said that right now I'm imbalancing my life for the purpose of my competition, but when I get back to normal life, that's different for everyone. You're going to be able to do what it is that you need to restore what you've determined to be optimal. And that's how I think everyone needs to look at it.
And I notice it so much in kids. Obviously I've got 3 kids now, so I'm at a lot of sporting events and, baseball, hockey, gymnastics, all these things. And you notice it in the temperament and the mannerisms of children. This is something I love to introduce to parents. It's like there needs to be a book on, like, this is how you need to feed your children. This is what you need to not give them. Because most people go, oh, it's a kid. It's okay. They're allowed to have shit. But it's kind of the opposite, right?
Kids are in even greater need of optimal nutrition because they're chronically anabolic until they stop growing, right? And anabolism, as you know, requires enough resources to drive the process. And kids in North America nowadays, they eat absolute shit. They eat for taste. Parents fall for the marketing that, a cartoon character on a box is going to get their kid to develop a relationship with a breakfast cereal. And they make, parents make separate meals for their kids. It drives me nuts. When I was a kid, I ate whatever my parents were having, and it would be, cut up or mushed up or whatever I could manage. But nowadays, it's, it's grains with a side of dairy and some sugar and, God forbid, a vegetable approaches someone's plate.
Right. And I think the biggest, not that this is kind of off topic, but I think the biggest thing that I notice is, parents trying to be the better parent. Although so many parents are divorced and, single parent, well, I want my child to like me more than they like the other parent, so I'm going to give them whatever the hell they want. And that just ends up being the worst slippery slope for the child, like parents are, I'm going to let them eat McDonald's every day. I'm going to let them eat donuts or whatever because I want them to think I'm the better parent. But, they don't realize how much they're screwing up the child long term.
100%.
Anyways, man, I don't want to let this go on too long, but I'd definitely love to have you back on. So I think those are extremely valuable takeaways. Is there anything you want to add before we wrap up?
I guess if people are interested in some things to find out more about what we're talking about, I do run a podcast, and I'm going to have you on it very soon, called Metabolic Mastery Radio. So that's where you can kind of dive into some of these topics. I typically interview experts in the field, so I am on the other end just asking questions and learning. And it's a fun project. It's for people who want to actually not just understand the what, but the why and the how behind things.
Nice.
And if anyone resonates with anything that I was speaking about today, you can find me on Facebook, on Instagram, and through a company called ATP Labs. I do all the education for them. So I often write an article or potentially will throw up a video on their Facebook page or website. So that's really about it, man. Other than that, I'm not too interesting. I'm just a science nerd who loves to research.
Cool, man. And if anybody has questions they want to ask, guys can just scroll down below and drop questions in the comment area. Feel free to give us an email. Obviously, you guys know where to reach me on social media or on my website directly. Thank you very much. That's it for now. Roland Pankewich, I appreciate you being here, man. And we will definitely talk to you soon.
My pleasure, Ben. Thanks for having me. Look forward to it.
Join us on benpakulski.com to learn the cutting-edge techniques to take control of your body, your brain, and create your greatest life.